So on today's call, NSC Federal Policy Director Rachel Gragg will discuss the upcoming fiscal debates, including sequestration, the debt ceiling in the federal budget, and the potential implications that those have for workforce funding. Before I hand things over to Rachel, I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to all of our financial supporters calling in today. These updates are among the many state and federal policy resources that National Skills Coalition provides for those in the workforce field, and they are made possible by the generosity of our foundation and philanthropic partners, organizational supporting members, and individual donors. We hope that those of you who have not yet invested in our work will consider joining the individuals and organizations across the country who have made their contribution to move our common skills agenda forward. You can join us at www.nationalskillscoalition.org/get-involved to make an individual donation or to become an organizational supporting member. Also, I want to let everyone know that today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email later today with a link to the recording. We've got a lot to cover this afternoon, and we want to make sure to have time to answer your questions. So without further delay, I'm pleased to turn it over to Rachel Gragg. Rachel?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to everybody who's on the call today. I know you have heard a lot about federal budget and funding issues and fiscal cliffs or fiscal slopes or fiscal speed bumps or whatever it is. I know you've heard a lot of talk about this really over the course of the last year and certainly at the end of last year. So we're going to try and give you some basic information about what happened really at the end of the 112th Congress around the fiscal cliff and what that sort of means and how that will sort of continue to play out in the current 113th Congress. So let's see what they did. All right, so thinking back to the fiscal cliff, which has sort of been dealt with now. We've at least we've moved on from talking about the fiscal cliff. But what was the fiscal cliff? So you may remember early on last year, it became apparent that there were three big fiscal things that were going to happen almost simultaneously at the end of 2012. So there were a whole slew of tax provisions that were going to expire on December 31st, primarily the lower tax rates that were passed in 2001 and 2003, typically referred to as the Bush-era tax rates. There are some low-income tax credits that were getting ready to expire, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is a post-secondary tax refundable tax credit. But there was a whole bunch of tax policy and provisions that was going to expire at the end of 2012, and which would really, if allowed to expire, would really cost the average household quite a bit of money, about $2,500. And so there was a lot of concern that you couldn't just sort of let all those tax provisions expire across the board without really jolting the economy. But adding to that concern was the fact that as part of the Budget Control Act, which was passed in order to raise the debt ceiling in August of 2011, the sequesters were put in place, right? And probably you've all now heard a lot about the sequesters, which are these deep, automatic, across-the-board cuts that were triggered when the super committee failed to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings. These cuts are applied automatically across the board to both defense and non-defense discretionary spending. And then the third thing that we figured out was going to be happening at about the same time is that we were actually going to hit the debt ceiling once again. So even though they raised the debt ceiling in 2011 and put the sequesters in place to sort of offset the cost of increasing the debt ceiling, it only bought us about a year and a half's worth of time, and we knew that by the end of 2012 we would be hitting the debt ceiling once again, and it would be necessary for Congress to increase the debt ceiling. So you had a lot of really big, potentially extremely impactful kinds of budget or fiscal issues that were all going to happen roughly at the same time, and causing a lot of concern, of course, because we are still in the process of recovering from the recession, and most economists sort of had dire predictions about if all of this were to happen, it could potentially push us back into the recession. So that was what the fiscal cliff was originally about. As with any piece of legislation that is a must-pass piece of legislation, especially one happening late in the Congress, it sort of evolved and became a vehicle to take care of a lot of things that needed to be taken care of at the end of the last Congress. And actually some of the things that the fiscal cliff was originally about like the debt ceiling, like the sequesters, did not really get addressed as much as you would have hoped. So the fiscal cliff, the main focus of the final deal around the fiscal cliff was on taxes and tax provisions. So about 2/3 of the total cost of the bill was spent on tax-related provisions. And the bill raised, according to the administration, the bill raised about $600 billion in new revenue. And if you remember, all the way back to the beginning, the fiscal cliff, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the debate around the fiscal cliff had to do with the federal debt and the federal deficit and trying to get that under control. And the president ran for re-election talking about letting the tax rates on the wealthiest households, people earning with income over $250,000 a year, letting the tax rates go up on the income above $250,000 a year so they could raise more revenue and put that towards reducing the debt and the deficit. And this bill did raise about $600 billion in new revenue. The other thing that the bill did that I think was that has gotten a lot of attention and that was an important component of the bill, besides just focusing on taxes, is that it did extend the expanded federal UI program through the end of 2013. So for another year, this is the program. It's a federally funded program that provides unemployment benefits for people who are long-term unemployed. So when their state UI benefits run out, they switch over to the federal program. And this is important because still about half of the people who are unemployed have been unemployed for about 6 months or longer. So it's really important. It was very important that this program be extended, and that did happen as part of this bill. One thing that is relevant to the workforce development field is that as part of that extension of the expanded UI program, the legislation kept in place a requirement that was already in place. So this is not new. This just maintains an existing provision that says that individuals who are receiving expanded unemployment compensation or this extended UI program, they have to come into a one-stop center for a reemployment eligibility assessment. So that will now stay, that requirement will stay in place for UI beneficiaries through this year. You can see a little bit more if you want a little bit more detail about what was actually in the fiscal cliff deal. So as I said, a lot of it focused on tax provision. So there are changes around income tax rates, capital gains and dividend taxes, the estate tax. They made some changes around the personal exemptions, what they call PEP and Ps, which has nothing to do with workforce development. They permanently fixed the alternative minimum tax. One thing that might be interesting to people on this call is they did extend a number of tax provisions that impact low-income and moderate-income individuals, in particular the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which was a provision that was originally part of the Recovery Act. It's been a signature item for President Obama and this administration, which is a refundable tax credit to help offset the cost of post-secondary education. That was extended for 5 years. All of these sort of low income or moderate income tax credits, the child tax credit, the expanded earned income tax credit, they were extended for 5 years. They were not permanently extended like a number of other tax provisions were. So we'll have to come back in 5 years and, if the political will is there, extend these tax provisions again. The other thing that was part of the fiscal cliff deal is there used to be a payroll tax holiday in place. So in people's paychecks, what they were paying into Social Security was reduced by 2%. That has been allowed to expire, and so now people's paychecks, people will probably be noticing a little bit less money in their paychecks because the payroll tax has gone back into effect and they're paying 2% more than they were last year. Aside from the tax policy, there were some spending provisions. As I said, the unemployment benefits, they've expanded that. That was beyond, besides the tax provisions, extending the UI benefits for a year was probably the most expensive part of the fiscal cliff deal. It also addresses sequesters. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. They didn't really fix the sequesters, and I'll explain what they did. They've only just delayed it for a little bit, and we're still going to have to deal with the sequesters. And then there were a handful of other provisions like this, what they call the doc fix. They extended the farm bill. So those of you who work on SNAP ENT or who run SNAP ENT programs, that program was not changed as part of the farm bill extension and is now in place and through September of 2013, which means that they will have to come back and deal with the Farm Bill again this year. But for right now, at least, the Farm Bill has been sort of essentially current law has just been extended through the end of the fiscal year. Okay, so what did the fiscal cliff not do? It did not address the debt ceiling. So we did, in fact, the United States hit the debt ceiling on December 31st, and the Treasury Department is now operating under what are called extraordinary measures, which means that they're sort of doing some fancy bookkeeping to allow the United States to continue to pay all of its bills and to pay its creditors and to pay the interest on the debt that we owe. And they're going to have to deal with that. And if you've been listening to the news and you've sort of been watching what's going on in Washington over the last couple of weeks, they really have turned their focus away from the fiscal cliff now that that's done. And the debt ceiling is really what they're working on right now, because we're going to hit the point at which, even using extraordinary measures, the Treasury Department is not going to be able to continue to pay our bills. And so we're going to hit that pretty soon. And so Congress must act in the next couple of weeks, or else we're back at risk of the United States defaulting on its debt. The other thing that the fiscal cliff deal did not do is it did not permanently turn off the sequesters. So there was some hope that we would be able, as part of the fiscal cliff deal, to just sort of get rid of the sequesters completely, figure out some other way to address efforts to reduce federal spending and not sort of have this very blunt instrument looming over our heads. They were not really successful in that. They have essentially managed to delay the sequesters by 2 months, but that is probably next up in the queue for what we have to deal with. So what does this mean, right? If this is what they managed to do in the fiscal cliff deal, where are we? Basically, we still have 3 major hurdles to get over in the next 3 to 4 months. So we still have to deal with increasing the debt ceiling. Congress is going to have to figure out some way to do that, or risk defaulting on our debt. We still have to figure out a way to turn off, or you may hear people start to talk about this phrase, buy down the sequesters. So nobody is talking about not reducing the debt. And so there's still this focus in Congress about federal spending is you know, if not out of control, we're spending more money than we have, and we've got to figure out some way to do that, to bring down that spending, that overall spending. What they're really arguing about is not whether or not we need to reduce the spending, but how we should do it. Should it be through defense? Should it be through non-defense? Should it be through more revenue? Everybody sort of in general agrees that it shouldn't be through the sequesters, but beyond that, there's very little agreement. So we need to figure out some way to continue to reduce the federal debt, maybe not through the sequesters, but there hasn't really been a clear sort of articulation of what the alternative to the sequester might be. And then we also have to finish FY 2013 appropriations, even though we're well into fiscal year 2013. Congress has not yet actually finished any of the FY 2013 appropriations bills. We have been operating under what's called a continuing resolution, or a CR, since October. The current CR will expire at the end of March. And so Congress is going to have to figure out some way to finish out FY 2013 while sort of simultaneously starting FY 2014. And there's always some risk or some threat that if things go badly, we could face a government shutdown. That's usually when it's usually around these continuing resolutions where you'll start to hear some chatter. If there is a risk, when there is a risk of a government shutdown, it's usually around continuing these CRs or finishing out the FY 2013 budget process. I flagged those as sort of the 3 main things we have to get through, but I also, you'll see at the bottom of the slide, I've made a little note that I do expect that some of this will spill over into FY 2014, into the FY 2014 budget and appropriations process. Some of the conversation that's happened just in the last week or so has definitely made that much more likely, and I'll explain that, because some of the conversations that they're having around the debt ceiling are now getting tied to the FY 2014 budget process, and I'll explain that as we go. But basically the idea is there's sort of a set of fixed targets over the next 3 or 4 months, and then even then we won't really be done. I have every expectation that this conversation will sort of carry on as we go into FY 2014 funding conversations as well. Okay, and just to give you a little bit of a sense of the timeline, here's a little calendar. So you can see on December 31st of 2012, the tax policies expired. We hit the debt ceiling. Congress literally at the last conceivable second 1159 on December 31st passes this fiscal cliff legislation. So we do not sort of have all of the tax problems that people were afraid of. And we delay the original sequesters, so not on January 2nd. The sequesters do not go into effect. They get delayed until March 1st. But you can see as we go into February, the best predictions are that we will, Treasury will be unable, even using extraordinary measures, to meet our fiscal responsibilities sometime between February 15th and February 28th. There's nobody who thinks we will make it past February 28th, and in fact, most people think it will be much closer to February 15th. But somewhere towards the end of February, unless Congress does something to raise the debt ceiling, the United States will no longer be able to pay any of its bills, or all of its bills at least. And then on March 1st, the delayed sequesters would take effect. So not January 2nd anymore, now it's March 1st. And then March 27th, the current CR will expire if Congress fails to either finish the FY13 appropriations, do some sort of omnibus bill, or another a year-long CR. We risk this going back to this debate about a government shutdown. Okay, so I'm going to just break each one of these apart a little bit, and I know I'm sort of clicking through this, but I will have plenty of time for questions. So if there's something that does not make sense, please just put a little. You can type a question into the little chat box, and we can come back to it, or make a note, and you can ask it when we get to the end of the PowerPoint presentation. But let's just start with a debt ceiling. So this is the one that is right in front of us. You may have heard on the news, the House, just in the last week or so, has come up with this idea. They're voting today. They're supposed to vote on a bill today that it would not raise the debt ceiling, but it would suspend the law that says that we have to raise the debt ceiling in order to pay our bills. So it would essentially just suspend the debt ceiling until May 19th. As part of the bill, it does require that the Senate pass a budget resolution by April 15th. This is a little strange because by law, technically the Senate is required to pass a budget resolution by April 15th anyway. It's actually written into the statute. The Senate has not passed a budget resolution in the last 3 or 4 years. The Senate has not actually managed to pass a budget resolution. There has been no consequence for that. So what the House bill, it would actually put an enforcement mechanism in place so that if the Senate fails to pass a budget resolution by April 15th, they would not get paid. Their pay would go into an escrow account and would be held until they actually manage to pass a budget resolution. One thing I want to flag about this is it looks like the language just requires the House and the Senate to each have passed a budget resolution by April 15th. It does not say, and it is not clear at this point, if it were that they would actually have to conference or agree on a joint budget resolution, just that each chamber has to have passed a budget resolution by then. And we expect that the budget resolution that the House will pass will look very different than the budget resolution that the Senate would pass. And so even if both chambers manage to pass a budget resolution, it's not at all clear that they would ever be able to agree on combining it into a final joint budget resolution. But in order to raise the debt ceiling or to suspend the debt ceiling to buy us a little more time to get us through the middle of May, this seems to be something that everybody is okay with, that both the House and the Senate will have passed a budget resolution by April 15th. And it does seem likely that this legislation will easily pass in both chambers. The administration released a statement of administration policy yesterday saying that they would not object to this bill, that the President would sign it. So I think there's every expectation that we will buy ourselves at least a few months to continue this conversation about the debt ceiling, that we will essentially push the debt ceiling debate off until later in the year. It's really unclear right now how this debate will play out. There's very few people who have sort of articulated a clear strategy for dealing with the debt ceiling. Previously, Speaker of the House Boehner and the House majority have been pretty clear that in order to raise the debt ceiling, they want to see this sort of one-for-one cuts in spending. For every dollar that we increase debt ceiling, we need to reduce spending by an equivalent dollar. This has been called the Boehner Rule, and this was really what they did. The Budget Control Act, it basically was a law that implemented the Boehner Rule, and it said we will increase the debt ceiling by $1.2 trillion, but you have to come up with $1.2 trillion in cuts to offset that. And they had been very sort of strongly committed to that, and I think we were very concerned that if the Boehner Rule becomes sort of precedent, that would be very damaging, because every year we're going to have to raise the budget. There's no question that we're going to have to raise the debt ceiling this year and next year and the year after that and the year after that. And if every year we have to come back and every time we raise the debt ceiling we have to do an equivalent amount of cuts, we could spend the better part of every year just trying to fend off $1 trillion in cuts just to raise the debt ceiling. So it is encouraging to see this change where the House is willing to at least suspend the debt ceiling for the next roughly 4 months without requiring, at least in the same piece of legislation, these sort of one-for-one cuts. But it's not really clear that they've changed their mind around pairing cuts with an increase in the debt ceiling, and I think people are sort of trying to figure out how they're going to come back to that or how that's going to come back into the conversation. But so the good news is at least in the short term, you have sort of broken this connection between increasing the debt ceiling coupled with equivalent spending cuts. So the bill that they are voting on today, that the House is voting on today, that we expect the Senate will pass and the President will sign, does not have any spending cuts in it paired with suspending the debt ceiling. So that's the good news in the short term. The bad news is in the longer term, because they have delayed the debt ceiling until May, it's going to more closely sync up now with the budget process. So if you think about it, right, they've written into this bill that the House and the Senate must have both passed a budget resolution by April 15th. If you think about it taking, 2, 3, 4 weeks to conference the budget resolution, the House and Senate budget resolution, and reach a compromise, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the budget resolution and the debt ceiling increase are now linked together. That conversation around the budget resolution and what Congress's funding priorities will look like in 2014, you can see the possibility that that's where they will tie this conversation about funding and spending cuts and the debt ceiling back together. And it is possible it seems, if not possible, perhaps even likely, that they will use, the House will try and write into the budget resolution reconciliation instructions. And some of you have heard us talk about reconciliation before. It's a special process that allows for expedited spending cuts, particularly on the entitlement side. So for programs like food stamps and Medicaid and Medicare, TANF, the mandatory spending programs, reconciliation lets you make changes to those programs to generate savings. We've gone through reconciliation a bunch of times in the last few years, and it would not be at all surprising to see reconciliation come back up again as really a way to drive pretty deep savings as part of this conversation about reducing the debt and the deficit tied to increasing the debt ceiling. The other thing that this conversation does, this fact that they've delayed the debt ceiling, is it reorders the timeline. So originally we thought we were going to have to deal with the fiscal cliff, then the sequesters, then the CR. Now we have to deal with the sequesters, then the CR, and then the debt ceiling. So it does actually impact the dynamics because people here in town have tried to do it as part of the fiscal cliff conversation, and I think there would have been some interest in doing it as part of the debt ceiling, of sort of tying all those pieces together, right? Because that's where you sort of have the most leverage. That's where you can do the kind of horse trading that policymakers here in D.C. are inclined to do. And if they all get pulled apart, then you sort of have to deal with each one independently, and that creates its own issues and concerns, I think. So let's talk about sequestration. So if they pass this legislation delaying the debt ceiling, sequestration will actually be the next thing that we have to deal with. And it's coming up pretty quickly. It's the middle of January. If we don't do anything, the sequesters will go into effect on March 1st. And again, it's unclear how this debate will ultimately play out. That's kind of a running theme. I'm sorry that I don't have a clear answer for you about how this is actually what's going to happen. But because there's so many moving pieces and because things are sort of changing pretty rapidly, like I said, these dynamics are changing about what the debate will look like, I think. No question, most policymakers agree that the sequesters are the wrong way to reduce the deficit. It's seen as a very blunt instrument. The administration and the agencies have very little ability to do anything other than just make these across-the-board cuts, so they can't really say, well, we'll take this much out of this program and this much out of this program, and it will equal this total. It's really, you know, it just literally just whacks off the top of a whole bunch of programs. I think there's still a lot of confusion about how you would actually implement the sequesters. There's a lot of programs where it's not clear. Programs were forward funded, or if they have advanced appropriations, or if it's grants. You know, if you've already got the grants, that means it'll have to be clawed back. And I think there's just in general a lot of confusion about how the sequester would actually be implemented if it were going to go forward. So no question, universally 100% across the board, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, everyone agrees that the sequesters are a bad way to do this. It was never meant to be an actual thing, right? It was just supposed to be a lever to force Congress to act. Nobody expected it to be implemented. Now we're very close to seeing it implemented, and while everybody agrees that this is not a good way to go forward, there is very little agreement on how to actually fix it. So you have some people who feel very strongly that we need to undo the defense sequesters, that we should not be cutting funding from defense while we have soldiers still overseas, while we're still fighting 2 wars, that we just, you know, we can't, that they talk about hollowing out the military, and that we really absolutely cannot afford to make those defense cuts. And you know, there's some people who are advocating to just shift the cuts to defense over to the non-defense side, keep the same amount of cuts, but just undo the defense sequesters. There are other people who feel very strongly that we should not have the non-defense cuts, that those are the programs that include job training programs, that these programs have already been cut a lot since 2010. So there's been about $1.5 trillion in cuts to discretionary programs since 2010. These are the only programs that have absorbed any cuts in this whole debate, and that, you know, there are people who are arguing, including National Skills Coalition and the NDD Summit, that these programs have already done their part. They cannot afford to take any more cuts, and Congress and the administration need to figure out some other way to address the debt and the deficit, because these programs, you cannot balance the budget on the backs of these kinds of programs. These are core government functions, and you know, there's sort of a diminishing return. The more you cut, the more damage that you do, and the more damage that you do, the more supports that people need. And this is just you know, you're not really generating the kind of savings that you think you are. One thing that I have noticed, and this is sort of my personal impression, I feel like there's less urgency in Congress about the need to undo the sequesters. You're not really hearing people talking about it as much, and you haven't seen the same level of attention to the sequesters as you did, you know, in the fall of last year, going into the winter of last year. I do think because of the deal that they made around the fiscal cliff, and the fact that they turned them off for 2 months, the actual cuts, if the sequesters go into place, the actual amount that's cut will be less. And the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities did some math, and it looks like for the non-defense programs, if sequestration would go into effect, the cuts would be about 5.1% instead of the 8.2% that it would have been originally. And I do worry that members of Congress are looking at those kinds of numbers and saying, well, 5.1% is not as bad as 8.2%. It also gets spread out more broadly now because of the Sandy aid. That investment is also subject to sequestration, so it's getting sort of spread out across more programs now, which is why the overall cost is coming down. But I am concerned that members of Congress may be starting to I feel, like I said, less urgency that it's vitally important that we undo the sequesters. And that's just, again, that's just sort of a loose impression that I have. I don't have any hard data to back that up, but we're just not hearing people talk about it in the same way. I think there's also this challenge, again, as a standalone piece of legislation, if it's not tied to the fiscal cliff, if it's not tied to the debt ceiling, if it's just a single, you know, you just need to figure out a way to turn the sequesters off. There are people who feel very strongly that you should undo the defense sequesters, but not the non-defense sequesters. There are other people who feel equally strongly that you should undo the non-defense sequesters. You know, again, it's very hard to see where the compromise is, and I guess I do have some concern that without somebody being able to figure out a way forward, the sequesters could just simply go into effect, you know, and Congress just moves on to the next thing. So the next thing is the continuing resolution. This is sort of the least contentious of all of these different things that we have to deal with in the next few months. The Appropriations Committee has been working on finishing the FY13 appropriations bills. They have a little bit of extra wiggle room. It's very complicated and very technical, but because of some changes that were made as part of the fiscal cliff deal, they have about $2.5 billion more to spend in FY13 on the excuse me, on the non-defense discretionary side. So as of right now, it seems like they will not have to make sort of the excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Some of the very deep cuts that I think we were afraid of before the fiscal cliff deal, because they do have a little bit of wiggle room, and it seems like sort of all the reports as of right now it seems like FY13 appropriations is moving forward without a lot of drama around it, I guess. I should say, though, that could change. Everything in D.C. is always subject to change. Because they have pulled apart the debt ceiling from the spending cuts, you could see some fiscally conservative members of Congress who start to insist the sequesters must go forward, the FY13 spending bills must make spending cuts because, again, we have to get the debt and the deficit under control. Even if we allow the debt ceiling to go up, we need to use other opportunities to bring down and get our spending under control. My best sense is I don't think that will happen with FY13 appropriations. I think it's much more likely to play out as part of the FY14 budget and appropriations process. But anything is possible. So let's talk a little bit about the FY14 budget process, which is actually underway. In a normal year, the President should be sending his budget up to Congress on the first Monday in February. They've already said this is an inauguration year, sometimes in the first year of an administration's new term. They delay the budget. The administration has already told Congress that they will not be sending their budget up until sometime in March. So we will not have a budget from the administration. Sort of as we're going through these other conversations, we will not yet have seen their budget proposal. So there's a little bit of sort of a sense of operating in a little bit of a vacuum because we don't know what the President will be proposing for FY14. Also, Congress is likely to start moving forward on their own budget process since they do have to have a budget now. They will have to have a budget in place by April 15th. It's very likely that the budget committee and both the budget committees in both the House and the Senate will start to move forward on the budget process even before they get the administration's budget proposal. So you're going to have a lot of sort of pieces moving in the FY14 budget and appropriations cycle that are a little bit out of sync, that are not sort of following the normal order where first we get the President's budget, then Congress acts based. They can ignore what the President says or they can take it up, but usually they at least know what the administration is saying before they start to move. And I think they will not have the President's budget in time this year, and they will start that process before he sends it up. There will be much greater focus on the budget this year because of this requirement in the debt ceiling that both the House and the Senate must pass the budget resolution. I also think, though, it will be a much more important vehicle that they will use the budget resolution in ways this year that they haven't necessarily used it in the past, where it will be sort of the vehicle where they will create these mechanisms, including potentially reconciliation, to drive a lot of cuts. So if you think about, for example, the House budget that we saw last year, some people refer to it as the Ryan budget, the one that we saw last year and the year before that, and even in H.R. 1, the original appropriations bill a couple years ago, where we first started to see these very deep cuts coming up. I think we should definitely expect to see something like that. I'm concerned, I think there are a lot of people who are concerned that we will actually see even deeper proposed cuts than what we saw in the House budget last year and the year before, and that they will create this expedited process, include these reconciliation instructions that creates this expedited process that I talked about before that makes it easier for Congress to make cuts. So I do think that the budget, FY14 budget, is going to be very important this year, and there's going to be a lot of attention, need for a lot of attention to what's going on, because it will probably sort of build the blueprint for whatever funding fights we see for the rest of the year once we get past the debt ceiling, the sequesters, and finishing FY13. Okay, so that's a lot of talk about spending and funding fights and all the things that we've been working on for a very long time, and I know it's very fatiguing and it seems like this is never going to end. in talking to the administration, I think they feel similarly, and they have said just point blank that they want to deal with issues other than just the budget and the deficit. They feel like, if all we do is sort of grind through forever and ever these funding fights, we're just never going to be able to get to some of the other things that are very important, the sort of more policy-focused debates that I think a lot of people want to have and feel like we need to be having. And so they're going to try, my sense is that the administration, the Senate, are going to try and take up sort of on a parallel track to the funding fights. They're going to try and start to move some big-ticket policy items. In particular, you've heard in the news, you heard in his inaugural address, President Obama laid down a number of markers. Gun control, obviously, is very important. They've already put out some proposals, signed 23 executive orders, and they want to work with Congress to actually implement some legislative changes around gun control in this country. Also immigration, the President clearly making a commitment to try and move comprehensive immigration reform in this Congress. And there's I think there's probably a renewed interest in Congress around dealing with immigration, given the really vital role of immigrants in this country. So there are some very big-ticket items that are going to take up a lot of time and a lot of attention. Even so, we do expect attention to skills and workforce development, maybe not on the level of some of the top-tier issues, but there's no question that there continues to be interest in addressing the skills gap and making sure that workers have the skills they need and employers can find the skilled workforce that they need as part of an economic recovery. So just focusing on workforce development policy specifically for a few minutes, the administration has signaled in a bunch of different ways. We do expect that they will include several workforce development proposals, probably in their FY14 budget. It sounds like they will revisit things that were in their FY13 budget, so the Community College to Career Fund. We think that we'll see that again. I think that they will make some changes, so I don't think it will look exactly like what it did last year. But it will still be sort of the same basic concept of fund to support partnerships between community colleges and employers, really targeted to occupational training and workforce development. I think you will also see something, at least parts, if not the entire proposal, around the Pathways Back to Work language that was in their budget last year. And this was sort of a set of proposals looking at the providing job training and workforce development for the long-term unemployed, for people who are very low skilled, people who have been disconnected from the labor market for a long time, really sort of looking for innovative ways to address people who are either dislocated workers, disconnected workers, low-skilled workers, but really focusing on building that kind of infrastructure to help people who sort of need the help the most to get back into the workforce. I have every expectation that we will see both of those in their budget. They seem very committed to it. The President did talk about the need to invest in the skills of our workers in his inaugural address. I don't know that that has ever happened before. There are sort of rumors now. There's a little bit of a whisper that we may see a new skills agenda coming out of the administration. So I definitely feel like the administration is focused on this. I think a little bit of a challenge is, it's great for them to talk about it. It's great for them to draw attention to it. I think it's a little bit of a challenge still to make sure that they're putting the right kind of policy underneath it and investing the political capital to move that policy forward through Congress. So we'll see how that plays out probably over the next few months. And then in Congress, again, there's lots of interest, there's lots of attention to these issues. There are a number of potential legislative vehicles that could be opportunities to deal with workforce development issues. So there's a whole slew of legislation that needs to be reauthorized in 2013. So WEA obviously has not been reauthorized in a number of years. It is potentially up for reauthorization. The House in particular continues to be very focused on WEA reauthorization. And we have seen some signals that they plan to move pretty quickly on the bill that they worked on in the committee last year. We expect that the committee will take that bill up again and we'll try and bring it to the floor. So there is attention to WEA. TANF is also up for reauthorization. It has been up for reauthorization for a number of years. There's been some renewed interest in TANF. You may remember last year the administration offered states waivers that wanted to focus on employment outcomes. That created a lot of pushback in Congress, and so there is some possibility that you may see a new focus on TANF reauthorization. Current technical education is up for reauthorization. The Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization. And TAA expires at the end of 2013. So there's a whole bunch of bills that sort of individually, independently deal with workforce development. There seems to be growing interest. You know, there's been this consolidation conversation. There seems to be growing interest in trying to figure out, are there ways that we can link across these programs through the different reauthorizations? Can we build a conversation that is sort of a more, holistic, you know, trying to move towards this idea of an integrated system and not these sort of rigidly stovepiped programs coming down. I honestly don't know how that's going to play out or which of these pieces of legislation they're going to take up. They may take up none. They may take up some of them and not finish them. And, you know, it's just very hard to know how Congress is going to prioritize. I will say TAA, I do expect that they will do something about TAA because that's one of those programs that if they don't reauthorize it, the program stops. In their budget proposal last year, the administration did propose allowing TAA to expire and replacing it with a universal dislocated worker program. I think we may see something like that come out of the administration again, and I think Congress will respond to that when it becomes time to look seriously at TAA. I think you might see a debate that we haven't seen before about whether or not we should continue TAA or whether or not we should shift to some other kind of broader dislocated worker program. That is not until the end of 2013, so TAA expires in December of 2013, so that debate may actually come a little bit later in the year, but I do expect we'll see something around TAA. Another opportunity that I think people are just starting to look at is immigration reform. No question, like I said, I think Congress will take up immigration reform in a serious way. The administration will push for immigration reform. There'll be a lot of political capital that goes to getting immigration reform finished. I think there's an opportunity there around workforce development because almost certainly whatever they do around immigration reform, they will have something about English language and adult basic education. In the past, they have talked about having an English language requirement for citizenship. So I do think that the workforce development community and people who are interested in adult basic education should be thinking about how do we get in front of that conversation, how instead of making it a stick, you know, just telling people that they cannot have citizenship without being English language speakers, but having no resources to help them do that. Are there ways that we can use this opportunity to really have a more serious conversation and make a more serious investment around ESL and adult basic education? I mean, then there's also a lot of interest around data issues. A lot of members of Congress are starting to look at what is essentially a very wonky subject, but they're very interested in it. There's a lot of attention to these issues around transparency and this idea that of an informed consumer. There's a lot of concern that a lot of people are spending a lot of money on post-secondary education and not getting a very good return on their investment. We saw this with the gainful employment regulation and some of the hearings that the Senate did. Senator Harkin is very concerned that proprietary schools, you know, are really overcharging, and people are taking out loans that they will never, ever be able to repay. And there's a lot of interest in helping students and parents and employers and anybody who's making an investment in job training or workforce development, helping them better understand how those investments match up to the labor market and what kind of payback on that investment you can expect. And I think we'll see some of those conversations play out in this Congress as well. All right, so what does this mean? It doesn't mean anything new. I'm going to tell you the same thing that I always tell you on every call and every time you talk to me or you hear me talk to you. These debates are not going to end anytime soon, particularly around funding. I think this is, you know, we are in this sort of fiscal austerity box, or this sort of overriding emphasis on reducing the federal debt and bringing down the deficit. That's just not going to go away. Even if we get through the fifth fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling and sequesters and FY13, even if we get through all of this, it's not the end. They're still going to be having these fights about further cuts to a number of programs, including job training programs. Even though we're sort of in this funding box, though, I do think that there may be opportunities to address workforce policy issues in a way that maybe there hasn't been before. I think there continues to be increased attention to the need for a skilled workforce and increased interest in this issue. Lots of disagreement about what we actually do about it, but at least the attention is there and the interest is there. There are a tremendously huge number of new members of Congress. About half of all the members of Congress are have been serving for less than 5 years. Many people who are now sophomores or freshmen, and they're making decisions, I mean, really right out of the block, right? I mean, they will be making funding decisions literally weeks after they take office. Some of them have never served in public office before. They know nothing about these programs. They know nothing about how the budget plays out. They know nothing about how the decisions they make will impact people in their local communities. So it's really important. It's more important than ever that we continue to educate members of Congress, just because many of them, if for no other reason, they're sort of operating in a little bit of a vacuum because they're brand new to a lot of these conversations. So what can you do? Again, this is nothing that we haven't talked about before, but I just want to emphasize again, it's really important that members of Congress hear from you, that they understand what your programs are doing in their local communities, and that they understand what the impact of the decisions they make will be on your programs and on the people who live in their local communities. There's lots of work going on in D.C. around these issues, so there are broad coalitions around budget issues. The NDD Summit, which National Skills Coalition co-convenes with the Committee for Education on Education Funding and the Coalition for Health Funding. There's a broad budget coalition that's convened by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and AFSCME, and Save for All, which is convened by the Coalition on Human Needs. These are all coalitions that focus on different aspects of the budget and funding. The Campaign to Invest in America's Workforce, which National Skills helps co-convene. You can see the picture here. These are all groups that are members of the Campaign to Invest in America's Workforce. It is focused specifically on workforce funding issues. We have lots of materials available. We're all sort of working together to try and put down through our networks the same kinds of materials. And we're all trying to take action to help raise the visibility and give all you folks in the field and in the local communities the tools that you need, and give you the materials that will help you raise the visibility of workforce programs and what's going on in your local community. So this is, again, this is not new. This is the same thing that we ask you to do all the time. We're just asking you to keep doing it. And I know you're exhausted, and I know this has been going on for a long time. But we really do want to stress that the work you're doing has an impact, and it's really critical. Okay. Obviously, you can follow us on our website. You can contact me, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions or help you with whatever you need. But for right this second, I know I covered a lot of territory. I know I talked pretty quickly, so let's go ahead and start trying to answer questions. So Jen, do you want to let people know what they need to do to ask a question, or if they want to type one in?
Yep, absolutely. So just like before, on the left-hand side of your control panel, there's a little button that has a picture of a hand on it. If you have a question, raise that, and I will unmute your line. But in the meantime, we've had a few people that have already typed in some questions, so I'm going to start off with one of those. Okay. Sue Hoffman asks, is there any sense of what month the FY13 budget will need to be passed?
The FY13 budget? So we are in FY13. The continuing resolution that I talked about, that is what is funding us in FY13. So that's going to expire at the end of March, March 27th. So Congress will have to take action by the end of March in order to keep the government running. We expect that they will just finish out FY13. They'll either do a long-term continuing resolution or an omnibus appropriations bill. But we expect that by the end of March, they will have finished sort of all of the FY13 appropriations bills.
Okay, great. We have a few more that were typed in, but Adrian Ortiz has raised his hand. Adrian, I'm going to unmute your line if you want to ask a question. Hello? Nope. Okay. Adrian's not there, so I'm going to mute you again, and I'm going to unraise your hand, so if you want to come back and ask again, please do so. No one else has their hands raised, so I'm going to go back to the questions. Let's see. Larry Eisenstadt mentioned that the LA Times just indicated that the House has voted to temporarily suspend the debt ceiling, but then he also went on to ask, how does this policy affect youth workforce development? So Rachel, if you want to respond to that.
Sure. So raising the debt ceiling will have no direct impact on youth workforce development programs. And this is what I was talking about before. So in this particular piece of legislation that the House just passed, they are not requiring that sort of one-for-one cuts for every dollar that they increase the debt ceiling. They have not coupled it with any cuts. So this bill that the House just passed and that the Senate is likely to pass and that the President will sign will have no direct impact on youth or any other workforce development programs. In the sort of broader sense, people here in town, I expect that the House has not given up on this idea that we have to rein in this out-of-control spending, as they would put it, in order to continue to raise the debt ceiling. So I think we will come back at some point to this conversation about we have to make these cuts in order, we can't just keep increasing the debt ceiling without also making these cuts. So in the very short term, this piece of legislation will not impact any job training programs. In the longer term, though, I think we will continue to have this same debate about trying to get the federal debt and the federal deficit under control by cutting spending. And that will ultimately likely impact job training programs.
Okay, great. Tom Miller has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, Tom, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I'm noticing Adrian and Tom both have, they're both signed on to the webinar using your computer. If you don't have a webcam and microphone on your computer, you're not going to be able to ask a question that way. If that's the case, please select the telephone option under the audio panel and dial into that number, and that should let you get access to ask your question. So sorry if there are any complications with that.
Or you can also just type your question in if you don't want to.
Type your question and I'll read it too. We do have, oh, there's Adrian's question typed in. Do you have any talking points to local state legislative bodies that we could use when talking to local state legislative members?
We have general talking points about these issues, if that's what you're asking about these specific funding and policy issues. We probably, I suspect we do have talking points that are geared more towards state and local officials as well. And we can have somebody follow up with you if on that. You can use our general talking points. They could be used to talk to state and local officials, but I'm sure somewhere we also have talking points specifically for state and local officials. And if you send me an email, I will connect you with somebody who can help you with that.
Okay, great. We also have another question from William Jones. Has NSC taken any positions on the issues around for-profit colleges?
So we did weigh in on the gainful employment regulations. So National Skills Coalition does agree that there are some for-profit institutions that, without question, are probably significantly overcharging individuals or are charging people, tuition that they will never for occupations where they will never be able to earn enough money to pay back what they borrow. Not all for-profit institutions are probably doing that, but no question, we feel strongly that nobody should graduate from post-secondary institution or go through a post-secondary institution where they graduate where they accrue so much debt that they can never pay it back, particularly if it's not for a high-quality industry-recognized certificate or vocational credential. At the same time, though, we are a little bit concerned that Congress's focus on for-profits is sort of ignoring the fact that for-profit, there's probably a reason why some people are turning to for-profit institutions, because they often better serve the need of non-traditional students. And so we have emphasized to Congress that as you look at the role of for-profit institutions or proprietary institutions, that what they really need to do is try and figure out how to ensure that all people who are seeking post-secondary education and training have a way to do that that sort of works for them. And as they look at the role of post-secondary institutions, sort of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't create a situation where there's just not enough capacity or where there is only capacity that serves the needs of what people think of as traditional students. So we have not, we have not taken a position that says all for-profits are good or all for-profits are bad. We're really much more interested in a policy debate that is focused on making sure that all students have access to high-quality, affordable education that leads to an industry-recognized certificate or credential, 2 years of an associate's degree, or the first 2 years of traditional 4-year degree.
Okay, great. I'm just going to field a quick question I've been getting from a lot of people. There will be a link to the recording of this presentation that you'll get in an email following about an hour after the webinar is over. So yes, you will have access to these slides after the fact. We have another question from David Crow. I may have missed it, but what are the odds that the sequesters will go into effect on March 1st?
Right. I am concerned that the odds are going up, particularly since now everything has been pulled apart, and I think we will have to deal with the sequesters almost as a standalone problem. Like I said, there are a lot of people who think that the sequesters are a bad policy solution, but there's very little agreement on what to do instead. You sort of have two pretty divided camps right now. One side saying we need to undo the defense sequesters and just push them all over onto the non-defense side, which would be all those programs like workforce development. So sort of keep the same amount of cuts, but just push them off of defense and onto non-defense. There are other people who feel just as strongly that it should not be, we should not be doing the non-defense cuts. And there's really, I haven't really heard any policymakers right now offering a way out of this. You know, and anytime you heard people talking about the sequesters, about undoing the sequesters, it was always in a bigger context. It was always as part of a fiscal cliff deal or a debt ceiling deal where there were other pieces of sort of other points of leverage. And so, again, this is sort of a new dynamic where we're just starting, you know, so they're going to deal with the debt ceiling. They dealt with the fiscal cliff, and they're going to deal with the debt ceiling now. And so we're just moving into this sort of new dynamic where the sequesters are the next thing that's up, and it's, again, it's sort of standing alone. And I'm not sure how it's going to play out. I think if we do not do a very good job of helping members of Congress understand that even a 5.1% cut will have very serious consequences at the local level, and make them understand that this is not, these are not standalone cuts, right? They have been cutting these programs for the last decade, but certainly for the last 2 years. Since FY10, job training programs have lost more than $1 billion in just the last 2 years. The job training programs alone have lost more than $1 billion in federal funding. And so they need to understand that this is part of a longer conversation and part of a longer trend of disinvesting in these programs. And I think if they don't understand that, and if we don't really demonstrate the effect of the cuts that have already been made, you know, and what it will mean if these additional cuts go into effect, I do actually think that there is some chance that the sequesters could go forward.
All right. We have a couple more questions in the queue. Kristen asks, is there an opportunity to expand the conversation about community college to career to include other community-based training entities?
So National Skills Coalition feels very strongly that we would like to see that happen to make sure, you know, we think that community-based organizations play a vital role in these partnerships. We have certainly conveyed that message to the administration and to members of Congress. People who will be in D.C. for the summit, I should have mentioned the summit coming up, people who will be here in town, we will definitely, I think lots of people here will be focusing on that. I think that it is not a natural instinct in these conversations. People understand very clearly, members of the administration, people in the administration, and members of Congress, like the last few years have been very focused on community colleges, and I think they, you know, that idea of the role of a community college has sort of taken root with certain members of Congress and has strong currency in the administration, and I do think it's up to us to keep talking to them about, yes, that's an important investment. Community colleges play a critical role. It's really important to develop these partnerships with employers, but there are other organizations and entities that also need to be a part of that partnership. So I do think that we need to keep pushing that message up to policymakers.
Okay, great. And Kelly Watts has a question. I'm going to try to unmute your line, Kelly. I'm going to go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, am I online?
You
Yep.
are.
All righty, beautiful, thank you. I actually had typed it in, but I wasn't seeing anything with it, so I said, well, let me kind of raise my hand and see if we can get this in.
I saw that you typed the question in, but I think
Okay, beautiful. I'm just going to read it directly. My question is regarding the interest in data. What type of data would you suggest that we collect or even present to policymakers in order to demonstrate a better return on investment into workforce?
That is an excellent question. And I should clarify that when I talk about the interest that they're having in data, policymakers want to are looking at policies that would actually make more data, better data available out to the public. So for example, when somebody's making a decision about what college to go to, they want them to be able to look at, they want there to be a place where somebody could go and see, oh, if I get this degree, there's this likelihood that I would get a job in my local economy, and I would earn this much money, which means that I would be able to pay back my student loans in this much time. So on the policy level, that's the kind of conversation that they're looking at about what kind of data do we need to make available to consumers, to employers, to parents who are making these decisions about where to make investments in education and training.
Okay, there we go.
You're asking me about what kind of data we should be collecting to make a compelling argument to policymakers, right?
Correct, exactly. And my question now may actually be mute because it actually may be off mark of what you had presented in the slideshow.
It's not. I mean, it is a relevant question because we are always trying to figure out what is the most compelling story that we can tell, right? So the return on investment question is a little bit of a hard one because there are lots of people who do return on investment analysis, not just around workforce development, but around a lot of different programs. And I will say a lot of policymakers are sort of suspicious at best when you present return on investment data. But I do think that there is data that we can, that we should be trying to show people. I think, collecting information about industry-recognized credentials or vocational certificates and showing that people are actually completing and that they're getting placed into jobs and that they have a portable credential. I think that's the most compelling kind of data that we can show people, that these investments are actually having a tangible, positive impact in policymakers' local communities.
Okay. Okay. No, that's great. That answers for me. Thank you.
Good. Good.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Okay, we do still have some more questions in the queue. Let's see. Albert asks, does NSC have a detailed one-pager or a graph of how much specific programs have been cut in the last decade?
In the last decade. We do have some historical tables, so if you go to our website and you look under federal policies, you'll see a federal funding page, and it does actually show historic funding levels and the change over time in historic funding. We have a bunch of federal budget materials also, so you can sort of track back. I think it only goes back a couple of years looking at the cuts over time. I know we go back at least, we have a chart that we use a lot that shows the cuts since 2010. But there is some historic, I think it goes back to 2000 or 2002, sort of showing the funding trend lines across a bunch of different workforce programs.
Okay, great. Vanessa asks, can you provide more details on the possible structure of what a TAA/dislocated worker program merge would be like?
That is a very good question, and we have some understanding from the President's budget last year, which does not include a lot of detailed legislative language, so you have to kind of dig through the tables to try and figure out what they would be doing. And I think it could change between now and then, but I'll just tell you what it looked like they were proposing to do last year was to, like I said, let TAA expire, use the money from TAA, and pull the dislocated worker funding stream out of the Workforce Investment Act, combine that with the TAA funding, and use that as the funding, put some new money in as well for a universal dislocated worker program. It looked like the benefits that people got under TAA would be reduced a little bit, so there would not be as much, they would not have as much income support, and the training would be a little bit shorter. But it would increase the benefits that would be allowable, that would go to a dislocated worker. Say somebody who was previously a dislocated worker under WEA, their benefits would get richer. The benefits for somebody who would have been served under TAA before would get a little bit worse. But sort of on average, you'd get this sort of right somewhere in between TAA and WEA dislocated worker, new sort of benefit for universal dislocated worker program. That's really what we could tell from the table. It would not, I don't know what it would mean for WEA. Like, you can't really look at that and go, oh, what would they, there was no companion piece for what it would mean for WEA, other than you could look at it and you could see if you pull dislocated workers out, that would leave WEA adults and WEA youth as sort of this other program, and which has its own complications then, right? And they didn't talk about that in their budget. And I think as this year goes on, we will start to see this play out, and we will start to see more conversation about this. I think that this is actually an important conversation, and I think it will sort of spill over or cross or merge or blend or something with some of the consolidation conversations that are going on. So there's this big push to not have as many federal job training programs. And if we keep seeing funding cuts, I do think that the reality is probably that we will not be able to continue to just support as many programs as we currently have, just because there will not be enough money if these cuts keep going forward. So I do think that there will be greater focus on sort of a consolidation / alignment / integration conversation, and this could be one place where we see it play out. So, this may be an opening bid from the administration to have a universal dislocated worker program. Congress may take a different tact, and it may be smaller, it may be bigger, but this question about how do we make all these different federal job training programs more effective and more efficient, I think will play out, be it through a universal dislocated worker program or some other conversation. So I don't know if that was a good answer. We don't have a lot of details yet.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions in the queue.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. Tom asks, if sequestration goes into effect on March 1, will the total grant of WEA funding from fiscal year 2012 be affected, or only FY13 funds that have not been expanded as of March 1?
So I don't know for sure the answer to that question. I'm going to tell you my best guess based on other agencies, what they have said. So any money that has gone out, the agencies have been pretty clear. They will not claw, any money that has gone out will not get clawed back. So if you've got a grant, go ahead and spend it. They are not going to come back and say you have to give us money back. For WEA, for at least the adult and the dislocated worker program, since it is advance funded, what we understand, what we think will happen is that the money that has been advanced, appropriated already, will just stay, and you will not see the cuts until the money, the 20, now I'm not going to get it right, but no. So the current funding cycle will be unaffected. It won't be until the next funding cycle for at least adult and dislocated worker, because that is advanced funded.
Okay. Let's see. Michelle asks, what are the possibilities that WEA may not be reauthorized?
Oh, I think the possibility is always pretty high. Congress will continue to be very dysfunctional. It is highly, highly partisan. They got very little done in the last Congress. I expect they will get very little done in this Congress. I would not be surprised if things really start to fall apart around some of these big ticket things like gun control and immigration. And you start to see this sort of breaking down and moving into their separate corners. Having said that, maybe, again, like I said, there is really a lot of interest in addressing the skills gap and making sure that we're doing a better job of connecting education and training to the needs of employers. There's a lot of people who are very interested in this. WEA does not have to be a controversial reauthorization. And the House seems very committed, at least the House seems very committed to moving it. So, I think there's there's as good a chance as there has ever been that we will see WIA move.
Okay. So we're just about at our time, but we have a couple of really great questions that I'd really like for you to answer, Rachel. Is it okay if we go over a couple minutes? Okay.
Okay with me.
So hang tight, everyone. David asks, do you foresee any federal funding that's been cut in the last 2 to 3 years being restored in the next 12 to 24 months?
No. I mean, doesn't mean we shouldn't be arguing for it. Doesn't mean that we don't desperately need new investments. I think the administration will propose some new investments. I think they might actually propose it as mandatory money, so it doesn't have to go through the appropriations process. I think it would be a very heavy lift to get something like that through Congress. But maybe anything is possible, and I think we should be arguing for it, and I think we should be asking for it.
Okay. Dolores asks, how does senior employment program fit into the cuts?
CSEP will take the sequester just like all the other programs. It is not exempt, so it will be looking at about a 5.1% cut if the sequester goes into effect.
Okay. Andrea asks, could you explain why, if the sequesters go into effect, it would be a 5% versus an 8% hit?
Sure. So it's a little bit technical and a little bit complicated. There are two reasons. One is because under the fiscal cliff deal, they actually bought out part of the sequesters. So they made $24 billion in cuts to turn the sequesters off for 2 months. So if you remember, the sequesters they're not a percentage, they're a dollar amount, right? So the sequesters that previously, every year for the next 9 years, you have to cut $109 billion from defense and non-defense programs. So that has been reduced now. They've bought out $24 billion of it. So the dollar amount of the sequester comes down. So that is one part of why the percentage comes down. The second part of why the percentage comes down is because this is where it gets technical, but they changed the categories. So previously, before the fiscal cliff deal, the sequesters were split between defense and non-defense programs, and they have redefined that now to be split between security and non-security programs, which is a technical term. But what it means is that more of the cuts get moved over to the defense/security programs. So the cuts on the security side actually went up. So they will see about 7% cuts if the sequesters go into effect on the security/defense side. And the cuts on the non-defense/non-security side went down. And that's just a technical thing. It has to do with the definitions and the programs that are captured under those. But that's another reason why they've gone down. And then the third reason why the percentage has gone down is because since the fiscal cliff, they have passed $60 billion in aid for Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy victims, and those funds are also subject to the sequester. So there's just more money in the pot now, and it's getting spread across more programs. So all of that combined just brings down the overall total dollar amount of cuts, which is what brings down the percentage.
Okay. It looks like at this point we have 3 more questions in the queue, and then I'm going to say we can cut it off after that. And if anyone else has any additional questions, they can email Rachel directly at the contact info on your screen.
And Jen, before you ask me another question, going back to the one about the percentage, why does the percentage come down? Okay. The Center on Budget actually just did a paper that talks about this issue, and if anybody wants to see that, if you send me an email, I will send you a link to the paper.
Great. Okay. Keith asks, if we have a universal displaced worker program, would it be local or state delivered?
I suspect it would be state delivered. It looked in the President's budget proposal that it would run through the employment services, but I don't know that for a fact. And it could certainly change between here and then. Even if that's what the White House intended, Congress could do something completely different.
Okay. Let's see. Vanessa asks, how likely does it look that WIA may go to the community college systems?
I don't think it's super likely. The bill that the House marked up in committee last year did not move it to the community college system. And certainly that's where the House will start again. They will just take up something close to what they passed last year. We don't know what the Senate will do. But I don't think we will see, a complete move to the community college system.
Okay. And the final question, from Neil is, let's see, DOLETA is spending its funds on curriculum development instead of courses to actually train people for jobs. DOLETA is saying that this is because members do not want to pay for actual training. Is that your understanding?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Members, I don't know what they mean when they say members don't want to pay. Members of Congress?
Capitalized members, so that's my assumption.
Members of Congress? You know, I think that's a complicated question.
Yes, members of Congress.
So right. So there's no question, right? The Workforce Investment Act is significantly underfunded. Just doing sort of the core functions, maintaining and running and the one-stops and doing sort of basic core services probably takes up a lot of resources in the system. There's not probably as much money as we need to even begin to address adult basic education and pay for occupational training and all the things that I think everybody in the workforce development system would like to do. So, so I do think that there's probably a lot of triaging. I think DOL is acknowledging that there are a lot of places where they wind up triaging and doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. Congress is not investing the way that they need to invest in job training and workforce development. They do not seem to be interested in making those investments, even though they talk about it a lot. And I do think that places will continue to struggle to provide adequate services and supports and access to actual education and training as long as Congress continues to not make adequate investments in these programs. So I don't know if that was the answer if that answered your question, but I think that is probably, yeah, Congress is not making the kinds of investments that we need.
All right, great. Neil says thank you. So hopefully that answered your question. So I'm going to say it's time to wrap it up. Thank you to everyone for joining us on today's call. We provided a lot of information, so if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to Rachel at the contact info you see on your screen. You'll continue to hear from us regularly about what's going on in Washington, as well as in the states through our regular e-communications. We'd also like to encourage you to subscribe to our website's RSS feed and follow us on Facebook and Twitter to receive the latest news on these debates as they happen. Thanks again for joining us. Keep an eye out for our follow-up email containing the recording of today's presentation. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to working with you all going forward. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.